Hello, welcome to Ravlic at Large. My name's Tom Ravlic. Thank you for joining me for this latest episode. Many of you will have heard about climate related reporting or climate financial disclosures. These are new things some companies are going to have to provide to the marketplace in their reporting packages in order to tell people what risks they have in relation to climate and also how they quantify those risks. Well, what are the costs involved? One of the elements in this is the reporting, and that is being dealt with by the Australian Accounting Standards Board through standards that have already been issued and regulated by the Australian Securities and Investments Commission. There's another side to this as well, which is the actual audit and the data will be looked at by people in the company and prepared by people in the company. Then assurance providers need to look at it and work out whether what the company has done makes sense within whatever framework it is applied. The body in Australia that deals with the guidance is the Auditing and Assurance Standards Board. Its chairman, Doug Niven, joins me to explain what the board is doing and where the board is at in developing audit guidance, as well as when people can expect certain kinds of reports to land. Doug, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for inviting me, Tom.
Absolute pleasure. Now, before we go into an interesting sort of table that tells people when the types of audit or assurance reports are going to be published and the level of credibility we can associate with them. Um, the foundational question is probably important. What is the audit board's role in this process in getting the Australian marketplace to reporting the climate financial disclosure regime as specified in the standards?
Hmm. And thanks for that question, Tom, because the Auditing Assurance Standards Board has a key role in this. There's been demand from investors and others for assurance around climate-related financial information, and ultimately it may expand out to other sustainability information. At the moment, it's a climate-first approach in the legislation, the Corporations Act, but you can have voluntary reporting and assurance around nature and human capital and so forth. As far as the Corporations Act is concerned, the reporting regime commences with the largest entities from years commencing the 1st of January 2025. Now, where the Auditing Assurance Standards Board comes into this is, I guess, three main parts. First off, we've been asked through the legislation, but we would be doing this anyway, to develop and adopt standards for auditors. And by the way, for the Corporations Act, it's the auditor of the financial report who is the one who signs off on the sustainability information. There could be others for voluntary assurance. But in that context, to develop standards around what's called reasonable assurance and limited assurance. And in that regard, we're looking to adopt an international standard fairly shortly. But the second part is there's a legislative framework here, and it gives you sort of a starting point and an end point for companies that are reporting or entities that are reporting under the Corporations Act. So it tells you the end point is for financial years commencing 1st of July 2030 onwards. It's reasonable assurance over all those disclosures you mentioned that are in the AASB standard, S2 on climate. But the AUSB is a body that's charged with figuring out the phasing in of assurance over the years leading through to 2030. Yeah, what should be subject to assurance when, whether it's limited assurance, whether it's reasonable assurance. So that's the second component. And then the third component is That international standard I mentioned is an international baseline, but it's, well, both practitioner neutral, but also reporting framework neutral. So we have a role in supplementing those standards that auditors and other assurance practitioners would be adopting with guidance in the form of frequently asked questions and so forth, but also developing an education program as well. So they're the three main components. Yeah, the core assurance standard, the phasing in of assurance over time, and guidance and education to assist practitioners and others, bearing in mind that there's a lot of work to be done in a short space of time. This is a new area for many companies, auditors, other practitioners, and we have a key role to play in supporting that process and assisting with people being able to get up to speed and understand the requirements and so forth.
There is something you mentioned in the answer you've just given, which is fairly comprehensive, that may be worthwhile fleshing out for people. Most people wouldn't know that there are three levels of assurance: a reasonable, limited, and bugger all assurance. That is no assurance at all. What is the difference between reasonable and limited assurance for those people to whom those two words or two phrases are complete and absolute jargon?
It's a really great question, and I'll preface my comments by saying auditors of financial reports and so forth have experience in this area, and they're familiar with the standards we've already issued for audits and reviews of financial reports. So audits involve reasonable assurance, and what's called reviews, which may apply to half-year financial reports, are limited assurance. Now, reasonable assurance, and there is an objective, a definition around this. The auditor obtains reasonable assurance that the financial report as a whole is not materially misstated, or in this case, the sustainability report with the climate information as a whole is not materially misstated. Now, reasonable assurance is a higher level of assurance than limited assurance. It's a positive sign-off. It's not absolute assurance. So it does involve things like sampling and so forth, but it's a high level of confidence around the financial report, whereas limited assurance is it's actually a broader range of assurance than reasonable. There's a substantial body of standards, guidance, and practice around reasonable assurance. Limited assurance can be, to be honest, anything from just below reasonable assurance going down to essentially close to what you said before, no assurance. But it's still a level of assurance where the practitioner is giving a conclusion as to whether there are reasons to believe that the information, whether it's the financial report, sustainability information, is materially misstated. And so the key is reasonable assurance is a positive opinion, and limited assurance is a negative opinion. So it involves work such as inquiries of management, analytical procedures, and so forth. So there's a bit of jargon in there as well, Tom, but hopefully that will give an idea. And by the way, that standard I was talking about on sustainability information goes through, and it's got comparative tables, what would be required in each phase of an engagement, from planning through to concluding a reporting under limited and reasonable assurance. But I do understand that it's a new concept for many, and we need to explain it better because it's actually the case, by the way, a key part of this is preparedness of companies. If the systems and processes aren't great, even under limited assurance, an auditor may need to do more work, and that can start to approach the work for reasonable assurance.
So let's just recap for those people that are out there and watching this, perhaps out of their own curiosity. What Doug and I have just outlined is that there are three levels of assurance. You've got the top tier, which is reasonable assurance. There is a positive opinion associated with that. Limited assurance, which you will typically find in things you've called reviews, which will be a kind of a negative assurance statement. Nothing has come to my attention that somebody's cocked something up. And then there's no assurance at all, which is simply what accountants would know as agreed upon procedures or things people agree with a client that they will look at and just um, reassess. It doesn't require them to apply auditing standards necessarily. It's just recalculation or redoing something and then telling the client what they found when they've redone it in effect. Having done that, Doug, there are in a kind of a complicated picture you've given me to share, and let's do that now because it is instructive. What are we looking at here?
Okay, and at first glance, it looks very complicated. I'll give you that, but we've tried to, in a diagrammatic sense, in a table, try and depict the phasing in assurance that our board has actually agreed on the 16th of December, would apply to mandatory assurance over mandatory climate information under the Corporations Act. And so I'll try and step through the table, but I do agree for people who see the table the first time, it's a bit mind-blowing. And so, as you mentioned, Tom, from a reporting perspective, there are three groups of entities, so it's phased in reporting. So for the largest entities, Group 1, the reporting commences, and I'm looking at the top of the diagram here, Group 1, Year 1, the reporting commences for years, commencing 1st of January 25, then for Group 2, as you go down, it's 18 months later, years commencing July 26, and then for Group 3, another year after that, 1st of July 27. So that's sort of broadly when the reporting starts. Then what we've been asked to do is create a phasing model, and we've decided, well, it makes sense to have consistent phasing in across all three of those groups. So the very top part of the table is simply saying for each group, the phasing in starts for a different year,
Okay.
but it comes in, on a consistent basis over time. So the bottom part of the table is showing in that very left-hand column broadly what the disclosure requirements are under the AASB standard on climate S2, and then for each of the reporting periods that follows on from that, what we'll be requiring in terms of no assurance, limited assurance, or reasonable assurance for those categories of disclosure. So that's explaining how broadly the table works, but I should pause there, Tom.
Now, if people look at the second half of the table where we have blue coloured cells of the United Nations, almost the United Nations baby blue coloured cells, we don't get to reasonable assurance until 2029 to 2030. Is that because everybody's learning at the same time and expecting people to report at the top tier level is possibly inappropriate?
Yeah. So you've essentially covered it. We did extensive outreach and consultation. We wanted to understand perspectives of investors, users, obviously the auditors and their experts, and the companies themselves in terms of their preparedness for having assurance. Obviously, the reporting's there. They've got to report in accordance with the standards from the AASB, but it is recognising that in a short space of time, there's a big uplift in terms of resources, capability, expertise, and that people are learning. This is often the first time they've had this type of reporting, and so not inconsistent with the approach taken by others such as ASIC. Giving people a little bit of space, and also it's trying to deal to some extent with cost considerations, although with the caveat I made before about limited versus reasonable. And so you're right. The idea is to give people a bit more space um, before reasonable assurance kicks in. And it is different dates. It's year 4 for each of the groups. It can be years commencing 1st July 28, which is, of course, 30 June 29, year ends for June, year end companies. But if you have a look at those orange boxes up the top there, that shows you which year reasonable assurance is mandated under legislation anyway. So, so yes, you're right. It's trying to give people a bit more space to build capability, expertise, and their resources. And the feedback we had was somewhat varied in this area because it is a new area. Some of the larger firms would say, look, we'll be there with the assurance, whatever's required, whenever. Others were saying they needed more time. And so, you try to balance things up as best as you can.
But
I should say this will be subject to ongoing monitoring as well, to make sure that it's working, that there aren't any unforeseen problems, and so forth.
this is a challenge, isn't it? Because you've got you will have the larger practices that have the resources who will be able to say they can do anything. They've also got the resources to buy talent in if they have to make sure that they're able to do anything by the specified deadline. You've got smaller, but still relatively large, but smaller accounting firms that will have clients impacted by the climate disclosure regime, but they will also have the challenge of competing for talent out there, um, depending on who they're auditing or reviewing at any point in time. Is that part of the consideration for the way in which the board and the government's approached it?
Oh, absolutely. And it's also reflected in the staggering of the reporting for the groups, because you can imagine more of the largest, the Group 1 entities, will be audited by the larger audit firms, and you'll have more of the small audit firms as you move down those groups, group in size, I mean. And so that's reflected in the start dates and reporting periods, yes, but also it's reflected in that staggering of no assurance, limited assurance through to reasonable assurance. And it was quite deliberate, to enable people to build that capacity. Now, for the smaller firms, I should say as well, and even for the larger firms, not all of the expertise needs to be in-house. It is possible to, and quite appropriate, that there would be actually more use of external experts and internal experts than there would necessarily be for the financial report, given the nature of the subject here. You need greater understanding of the business, geographies in which it operates, the regulations. And so it's quite possible that smaller firms will seek external experts rather than necessarily have them in-house. Obviously, they need to ensure the quality of the work that's performed by the external experts and take overall responsibility for their opinions and conclusions. But that's a consideration as well.
Now, well, you've just mentioned something that is really interesting, is often poorly understood by people who are looking at the auditing fraternity out there. What Doug has just indicated is that a smaller firm may need to use an external expert, but there is an obligation under the auditing framework, isn't there, Doug? I think it's 620 for the audit engagement partner to be satisfied that the expert is appropriately qualified and that they're able to rely on the work of the expert. And so this new auditing standard dealing with sustainability assurance provision
Yeah.
it needs to be looked at in concert with ASA 620 that talks about the use of an auditor's expert, right?
Yeah, it's consistent. So you're right. What's actually happened is, from a financial reporting context, there's a suite of standards, including 620, as you mentioned. There's also, on the sustainability side, this new standard. It's quite a large standard in terms of volume, which covers the similar sorts of areas, called, well, it's internationally ISSA 5000. Australia will be ASSA 5000. And it will also cover this question about the use of experts, uh, making sure they're perfectly qualified, competent, have the experience. And it goes beyond that, because when you use an external expert, it's about reviewing their work, making sure that the inputs that they used have been perfectly assured, all of those sorts of elements as well. So it's not just, oh, I found an expert and everything's okay.
So there's a process that people need to be conscious of when they're reading the material that that the audit firm has put into uh, an audit report. That there are many elements that go into doing this work. It's not just a case of an audit engagement partner knowing everything.
True. The audit engagement partner has responsibility, and look, they will need an uplift in skills potentially as well, because they need enough information to, well, first off, be able to select experts, review their work, but also in terms of the engagement. They'll need enhanced understanding of the business, as I mentioned before. So, overall, they're responsible, but they don't do all of the work themselves. And it just isn't feasible, particularly for the larger end of the market.
Now, we've spoken about the standard. We've looked at the magical table with all of the deadlines and the points at which the different audit reporting elements kick in, whether it's limited or reasonable assurance people are looking at. What else is the board going to be doing in relation to this guidance? Because none of this is easy, certainly not for the small to medium practices that may be engaging with the literature, is it?
No, look, that's absolutely true. And so we've been working on getting the standards out and so forth, but and that will be finished shortly. But at the same time, we've been very mindful. It goes to this third element, as we mentioned before, about guidance and education. And that's very important, particularly when it's a new area. People are coming to terms with, they've got a lot of questions as well, potentially. Larger firms have the resources here and internationally to develop their internal guidance, but that's not the case for the whole market. And so we clearly have a role in supporting, and it does to some extent go to supporting the larger firms as well. Firstly, dealing with some difficult questions that aren't answered in the international standard because they pertain to issues that arise under the local reporting framework. Bearing in mind that while ideally we'd have one reporting framework globally, and for financial reporting, a lot of work has been done across many countries to adopt similar standards, the same standards, but that's not quite the case with sustainability at the moment. And so there is a big challenge here in terms of the guidance. There aren't reports yet under these standards that someone can look at and see what's done, and the same goes for assurance. So we'll be developing frequently asked questions to deal with some of the more complex and unusual questions in a reporting framework. We'll be developing implementation guidance. Now, let me pause there and say we're not doing this alone. There's an International Auditing Assurance Standards Board, which will be releasing implementation guidance in January. And they'll be providing more guidance over time. It's not a sort of a set and forget approach for standard setters here or globally. We're obviously working with other national standard setters, or to be honest, Australia is ahead of most jurisdictions in terms of the reporting, introduction, and the assurance. But in addition to that sort of implementation guidance, frequently asked questions, we have a role in education as well. And so we are talking to others, the Australian Accounting Standards Board, ASIC, the regulator, accounting bodies, AICD, about how we can work together, well, firstly, to make sure we're consistent, but also to make the best use of the limited resources that we all have and provide the best support possible. And we've got different things to offer. We might offer some of the material. The accounting bodies have the membership bases. And so it all will come together, but there's a lot of work to be done in a short space of time.
Now, Doug, we've covered a lot of material in the past 26 minutes or so. There are resources online that people can access on the board website. So can you tell people where they can go to get that material?
Yeah, so some of the materials there already, a lot of it's to do with the development of the standards. There will be more material, but our website, keep watching it because there'll be more material over time, more frequently asked questions answered and so forth, is auasb.gov.au. And obviously, you've got the AASB's website, aasb.gov.au on the reporting side. And others, ASIC's got material up there as well, asic.gov.au. And the accounting bodies are working away as well. So, look, there's going to be plenty of help. It's all happened in a short space of time because the legislation was only passed a handful of months ago. We got the reporting standards. We're almost there with the assurance standards. But certainly, recognising while the first reporting is by the larger companies, 1st of January 25 years, it's going to come very quickly for others. And you do need to plan in advance, and we need to provide the support. So we're going to be doing a lot of work in early 25, I can assure you.
Those websites again, for those of you who are playing at home, auasb.gov.au is the audit board website. You will also see copies of the board agendas, board papers that are made public, and the highlights, documents and minutes when they're released. So you can understand the basis of decision making. AASB.gov.au is the Accounting Standards Board website. It also has comparable documents. It issues an action alert after its meetings, as well as a set of minutes subsequent to the meeting that the action alert reports on. So you're able to see what decisions the boards make. And Doug, thank you so much for your time in explaining that in as easy a way as we both probably could, given the complex nature of what we're encountering.
Thank you, Tom.
And that's another episode of Ravlic at Large that's been brought to you by YouTube, and I look forward to presenting some more of these in the very near future. In fact, much sooner than you think. Take care of each other, stay safe, and I'll be back with another episode of Ravlic at Large shortly.